They say the sky turned red that night, not like a sunset, not warm or lovely, but red like a wound, like something had broken open over Oak Path Plantation and spilled across the heavens. Martha stood at the far edge of the field, basin in hand. Her arms, wet from the last rinse of the day, dripped water onto the cracked dirt. The air, still and humid, carried the faint scent of smoke. Not wood smoke, something sharper, something older. She didn't blink. She just watched. Watched the glow rise behind the treetops. Watched the flames lick at the black sky, like fingers pulling down a curtain. Orange, fierce, silent, no screams, no bells, no warning. No, just fire, and the kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace, but from fear. No, because sometimes when the world burns, the loudest sound is what isn't said. People would ask later, was it lightning, an accident, punishment? Some whispered it was judgment, others called it justice. But Martha, she never said a word, never told what she saw, or what she didn't do. No, this is not the story of an uprising, not the story of revenge or escape or even heroism. This is the story of linen and silence, and a woman who knew how to fold both with precision. Before the fire, before the hush that swallowed Oak Path whole, there was just the wash, baskets of it. Linen stained with sweat, blood, milk, and tears, boiled in iron pots, scrubbed until knuckles bled, wrung out, and hung under a sun that never forgave. Martha had worked the wash since she was a girl of 13. By 29, she was the best laundress on the estate. Her hands rough as bark, her arms corded with strength. She could press a shirt with perfect creases and never let her eyes drift up. She had learned, like all the smart ones did, how to see without seeming to look. She saw plenty. The bruises that didn't match the stories, the clothes of children who vanished, the men who came and went too quietly, and she never spoke a word of it, because words were dangerous. She was known as Quiet Martha, the one who didn't mix, didn't meddle, didn't mutter. But they misunderstood. Martha wasn't quiet, Martha was listening. She listened to the floorboards creak outside the kitchen late at night, to the way the master's boots changed rhythm after reading a letter, to the preacher's voice, sharp and whispering, talking of cleansing and sacrifice. And in all of it, Martha kept folding. Folding sheets, folding sounds, folding fear into tight little squares, until Easter. Easter Sunday, when the chickens didn't cluck and the wind forgot to blow, when the bells didn't ring and the guests never came, when the fire rose and no one screamed. And if you're still here, watching, wondering what happened that night, hold on, because this story doesn't begin with fire, it begins with a ribbon, a stain that wouldn't wash out, a wash basin full of things better left unsaid. This is Martha of Georgia, and this is what she saw when the sky turned red. By dawn, Oak Path Plantation was already alive, but not with laughter, not with music, not with freedom. The sounds were measured, predictable, like a clock that ticked in chores instead of time. The iron bell rang at Su Ling A.M. sharp, always 3 times. Not 4, not 2, 3, always. That bell meant rise, no matter if you were 10 or 70, no matter if you'd barely slept or hadn't slept at all. It was time to move. And Martha always did. Move, wash, fold, repeat. She lived in the second row of cabins, third from the end, just behind the smokehouse. From there she'd grab her wooden basin, a brick of lye soap, and head straight to the waterline. And before sunrise, she could already have her hands wrist-deep in lins that didn't belong to her, scrubbing the lives of others off cotton and lace. But that was the strange thing about Oak Path. Every task was quiet, too quiet. The field hands rarely spoke. The kitchen workers barely whispered. Even the children ran without shoes, without laughter. Something about the place stole sound. Even the birds didn't sing before noon. To outsiders, Oak Path looked calm, disciplined, efficient. But to those inside, it was suffocating. It wasn't just labor, it was performance. every movement judged, every pause noted, every breath calculated. Martha learned long ago how to exist without drawing attention. She timed her movements to others, never too fast to stand out, never too slow to be questioned. That rhythm kept her safe, but it also gave her time to watch. The laundry gave her access. Everyone's clothes came through her hands eventually. That meant she learned things others didn't. Miss Tillman's silk shawl had tiny drops of red along the hem, not recent, but not old either. Master Tillman's shirts grew looser every month, his frame thinning. Worry did that to a man. The preacher's cuffs had ash marks, always on Sundays, not from candles, from something harsher. And the children? They were the ones she watched the closest, especially Sarah. Sarah wasn't hers. But she could have been. She was 7, hair in 2 tight braids, always tripping, always laughing, but only when Tillman wasn't near. She helped Martha sometimes, brought her clothespins, sat beside her on the steps. Once, Sarah asked, "Why you wash so quiet?" Martha didn't answer. She just smiled. Ain't because the real answer wasn't for children, because quiet washing was safe washing. Because in places like Oakpath, sound could betray you. A laugh could be taken as disrespect, a complaint as rebellion. Even a cough could earn you the wrong kind of attention. So they learn to live in silence. But silence doesn't mean blindness. In that hush, Martha saw everything. No, the way the overseer walked differently after speaking with the master, the way the cook tucked something wrapped in cloth beneath the stove, the way new faces arrived and old ones vanished without notice. And still the bell rang, and still the water boiled, and still the linens were folded just so. Oakpath was a machine, polished, quiet, deadly. And Martha? She was one of its gears, turning, moving, washing, until one day she wasn't. Because even machines break down, and sometimes, when they do, they burn. They said Master Tillman could see through walls. Of course, that wasn't true. But if you'd ever lived at Oakpath, it felt true. He didn't shout. He didn't whip in the open. He didn't rant or curse like other men of power. Instead, he watched, and somehow that was worse. He had pale blue eyes that never blinked enough, a thick mustache that twitched only when he was truly angry. He walked like a man who thought the earth owed him stillness. His boots never scuffed, his collars never wrinkled, and his gaze never looked hurried. Just heavy, as if it was weighing your soul. Martha had worked on the estate for over 15 years. In all that time, Tillman had never raised his voice at her, never touched her, never even spoken more than a handful of words in a row. And yet she feared him more than anyone. Because there's a kind of man who can control a room just by entering it. A man who can make everyone stand a little straighter, breathe a little quieter, exist a little smaller. No, Tillman was that kind of man. He had a way of appearing suddenly, stepping into view from a doorway or a stable or behind a tree. You wouldn't hear him coming, but once he arrived, you'd feel the air shift. It wasn't just his presence, it was the certainty that he noticed everything. He knew when a stitch was missed in a dress. He knew which child spilled milk at breakfast. He knew who stepped 1 minute late into the morning line. And most chilling of all, he never needed to punish out loud. Someone would simply disappear. A stable hand, a cook's helper, one of the boys from the mill, gone. No screams, no mess, just gone. Afterward, he'd sometimes tip his head slightly, glance over whoever remained, and mutter, "Standards must be kept." That was it, no threats, just an expectation. And it was terrifying. Martha once caught him staring at her through the window of the laundry cabin. She hadn't seen him approach. She only looked up and found his eyes already fixed on her. Not in anger, not in curiosity, but in the same way someone watches a wheel spin, waiting to see when the wood will finally crack. He nodded once, then walked away. She didn't sleep that night. Because if Tillman was watching you, it meant he was thinking about you. And if he was thinking about you, it meant your days were being counted. Martha knew stories. Stories of girls sent away to marry at distant plantations. only to never return, of older men who took sick and were never seen again, though no one ever dug a grave, of women who gave birth to babies that looked too much like the master's family. And the thing about Tillman was, he never explained. He didn't have to. His silence was enough. No, his power wasn't in what he said. It was in what people imagined he might do if they failed him. And so Oakpath remained obedient, controlled. But even machines under pressure can spark. Even the master's eye can blink for just 1 second. And sometimes that's all it takes for someone to finally act. The wind at Oakpath barely moved, but the clothesline always swayed. It wasn't the breeze, it was the secrets. Pinned between white sheets and pale dresses were the whispers. No one dared to speak aloud. The plantation's laundry wasn't just where stains were scrubbed out. It was where stories clung to fabric, heavy and hidden. Martha stood at the line every afternoon, pinning and unpinning. The rhythm kept her calm. Left-hand holds, right-hand pins, shift, repeat. But her eyes were never still. They scanned the yards, the porches, the forest's edge, because the laundry line sat at the heart of Oakpath. From there, you could see almost everything. And that meant Martha saw what others missed. She saw Thomas sneaking extra bread from the kitchen for his brother, saw Miss Tillman weep quietly behind the smokehouse, clutching a letter she later burned, saw the preacher hand something wrapped in velvet to the overseer, and neither looked at it again. Most would say it was just laundry, but Martha knew better. Every garment carried its own story. Blood along the inside collar of the master's hunting coat, tiny handprints on Sarah's white church dress, not hers, burn marks on a tablecloth. Though no candles had been lit that week, she wasn't guessing, she was witnessing. The line became her ledger, a silent book of warnings and worries. Sometimes other women joined her, helped fold, helped hang, but even in their chatter there was a carefulness, no names, no questions. Just nods and glances and the occasional that meant, I know what you know. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that Martha noticed the change. Ica dress, yellow, cotton, high-necked, belonging to Miss Abigail Tillman. It had a tear under the arm. Martha had seen that dress every Sunday for a year. It never had a tear. Miss Abigail was always meticulous, stitched tighter than her corsets. But now it was ripped. And the buttons, too, were missing. At first glance, it meant nothing. Wear and tear. But Martha's stomach knotted. That same day, Abigail didn't appear for the evening meal, nor the next. Servants said she was unwell, that she was resting, but clothes didn't lie. Clothes remembered everything. That night, Martha didn't sleep. She kept thinking of the dress, the missing buttons, the preacher's velvet bundle, the ash marks, the bruises too well hidden, the eyes that didn't meet. Secrets don't stay pinned forever. Sometimes they slip, Sometimes they flutter off the line and fall into hands that know what they mean, and when they do, they become fuel, not for gossip, but for decisions. No, because by now Martha wasn't just washing, she was collecting, counting, preparing, not with weapons, not with allies, but with knowing. She folded the yellow dress neatly, returned it to the chest where it belonged, and whispered a single sentence to herself. It's starting, because when a house tightens its silence, when its clothes begin to bleed stories, and when its people stop meeting each other's eyes, it means the threads are coming undone, and something or someone is about to break. Easter Sunday arrived like it always did at Oakpath, with ceremony and performance. The estate shimmered under the morning sun, polished and preened as if it too knew. It had guests to impress. Fresh-cut flowers lined the walkways, and white linens covered long banquet tables set under the magnolia trees. Every dish sparkled, every fork pointed the same way. Nothing out of place, it was the illusion of peace. Martha had risen earlier than usual. The extra laundry for the celebration had doubled her work, But she didn't complain. No one did on Easter. Complaints didn't mix well with guests. She moved quickly, folding napkins with perfect creases, her fingers moving almost automatically. She kept her eyes down, but her ears open. Faint chatter floated in from the main house. Laughter, clinking glasses, the low hum of a piano being tuned. The Tillmans always held Easter dinner outdoors, not for comfort, for display. Martha glanced up briefly to see the guests arriving. The men wore tailored coats and top hats. The women dressed in pastel silks, feathers in their bonnets like birds preening before a storm. Sarah stood nearby, adjusting the folds of the master's tablecloth. Her hands were shaking, Martha noticed. Easy, she whispered, almost without moving her lips. Sarah nodded once, then stepped back. No more words were exchanged. By mid-morning, the feast had begun. Roast lamb, honey-glazed carrots, buttered rolls, food so rich it glistened in the sunlight. The Tillmans sat at the head of the table, smiling, laughing with their guests. Their children passed around deviled eggs and sipped tea from porcelain cups. Everything appeared perfect. But Martha had seen too much to believe in perfection, especially not today, because something was different this time. The preacher had arrived early, clutching a new book wrapped in cloth. He didn't bless the food. Instead, he spoke softly to Mr. Tillman behind the garden wall. His face looked pale, his hands trembling. When he left, he didn't stay to eat. Strange. Then there was the dog, the big hound that usually guarded the gate, who walloped once all day. And by noon, no one could find it, stranger. And then there was Abigail, still missing, still unwell. But her dress, the yellow one with the tear, had been taken from the laundry that morning. Strangest of all. Martha felt her pulse rise, but her hands never faltered. She served the sweet tea, wiped the spills, and kept her movements smooth. Because something was building. The air was too still, the guests laughed too loud. The master watched everything too closely. When a storm approaches, animals sense it first. But people pretend. Pretend the clouds aren't forming. Pretend the wind doesn't smell like smoke. Pretend Easter is just another Sunday. But Martha knew better. She had seen the signs, heard them in whispers, felt them in fabric, carried them in quiet glances and folded clothes. Something was coming, not a rebellion, not a riot, something quieter, more precise. The kind of thing that doesn't announce itself, just arrives swift and final. The Easter feast carried on. Until it didn't. It began with a flicker, not a flame, not yet. Just a whisper of warmth beneath the floorboards. The kind you wouldn't notice unless you'd lived your life noticing everything. And Martha had, by early evening the feast was slowing, plates had emptied, wine glasses refilled. Laughter grew louder, sloppier, the kind of laughter that always ignored the people who poured the drinks and carried the plates. Martha was folding napkins near the house when she smelled it. Wood, not fresh, not firewood, old timber, dry, splintered, and heat faint but rising. She didn't react. Did Fort look up, just blinked slowly. Behind her, Sarah approached with a tray of leftover desserts. "You smell it?" Sarah whispered, low. Martha gave the slightest nod. Nothing more. The guests hadn't noticed. They were too busy debating politics and property, sipping peach wine, complimenting the roast. Even the Tillmans looked relaxed, or at least as relaxed as people like them could be. But the servants had gone quiet, too quiet. Footsteps slowed, conversations paused, eyes darted. Everyone smelled it now. But no one spoke, because speaking meant knowing, and knowing meant blame. Suddenly, the plantation's silence, that heavy, calculated hush, became suffocating. Then came the sound, a crack, like a knuckle popped beneath pressure. Then another, then a long drawn-out creak that echoed from the second floor of the house. Still, no one screamed. Not yet, but guests began shifting in their chairs. One woman fanned herself too quickly. A child asked, "Mama, what's that smell?" Then the window shattered. Just one. Just the upstairs hall. But from it poured smoke, black, thick, furious. The scream came next, not from the guests, but from the maid inside. Her voice sliced the air as she burst through the front door, coughing, waving her arms. Fire! Upstairs! The curtains! Now it was chaos. Chairs overturned. China crashed. Guests stumbled backward, shielding their faces. Some tried to run inside, toward the master's children, toward valuables. Others bolted down the path, dresses snagging on bushes. Mr. Tillman barked orders, but no one listened. His voice was lost beneath the roar of panic. Martha didn't move. No, she stood at the edge of the yard, still holding a stack of napkins. Then she looked at Sarah. Sarah was already watching her. They didn't smile, they didn't speak. They just nodded. Once. No, because this wasn't an accident, not a forgotten candle, not a tipped oil lamp. This was deliberate, planned, timed, measured. No, not to destroy Oakpath, but to break its spell. Martha turned, walking slowly toward the back shed. Inside, she'd stashed a basket, one she packed weeks ago. Not much, just essentials. Tools, bread, a small carving knife, a stitched cloth with names sewn in it. She wasn't running. Not yet. She was waiting. Because chaos wasn't the end, it was the cover. A fire distracts. It scatters the eye, the mind, but blame. And in that confusion, truth moves freely. Martha stepped outside just in time to see the second floor collapse inward. Flames reached the sky. The bell tower cracked. People screamed. And yet she felt calm. Because sometimes the only way to cleanse something rotten is to burn it down, not for revenge, for release. Oakpath didn't scream forever. Even flames die eventually. Even smoke runs out of breath. By morning, the grand house that once ruled the horizon stood blackened and hollow, a skeleton of ash and scorched wood. Its windows gone, its roof collapsed, its silence loud. No one sang, no one prayed. Even the birds avoided the sky above. The guests had long since fled. Servants either scattered or lingered in dazed silence, standing like statues beneath the twisted oaks. What was once the center of power now looked like a battlefield without soldiers. Martha returned to the yard just before dawn. She hadn't run. She'd simply walked the fields during the night, the stars her only witnesses. Her hands were clean, her face unreadable. If anyone asked where she'd been, she'd answer, working. And who would question her? The master's voice was gone, the mistress's silver gone cold, and the bells of Oakpath would never ring again. Sarah stood beside what was left of the well, clutching a cloth to her chest. Her eyes were red, but not from tears. Smoke had kissed everyone. Martha approached slowly. "Anyone inside?" she asked. Sarah shook her head. Not anymore. They didn't speak the names, didn't say Tillman, didn't say children, didn't say fire, because the truth didn't need sound. In the way back stayed straighter, right happily as man Shah's hamper on the botch. At traitor state. In the way the air no longer felt heavy. In the way Martha breathed, slow, deep, real. For the first time in years, she wasn't listening for footsteps behind her. She wasn't checking for eyes watching her hands. She wasn't hiding bruises beneath sleeves. She wasn't folding lies into linen. She was present, and the silence felt sacred. Word began to spread. Other farms whispered of the blaze at Oakpath. Some called it tragedy. Others called it judgment. Most simply didn't speak of it aloud, only nodded when the name was mentioned, eyes wide with unspoken knowing. The overseer, gone, the preacher missing, the hound found at the edge of the woods, muzzle burned, eyes wild. But Martha? She remained. She returned to the laundry, to the garden, to the sewing table. She tended the grounds, not as a servant, but as something else, something freer. There was no master now. Just memory. And in memory, there was space to reimagine. Children who once ran from shadows now played in the ashes. A boy carved a stick into a sword and pretended he was defending a castle, not surviving one. Martha didn't smile often, but she did that day because the silence that followed the fire wasn't empty. It was full. Full of the unsaid, full of possibility, full of something sacred that had never existed at Oakpath before. Choice. And though no one dared name what had happened, they felt it. Not just loss, shift. Something had turned. Not with rebellion, not with noise, but with knowing. And in that knowing, Martha stood taller. She knew there were consequences yet to come. She knew questions would be asked. She knew blame had a way of circling back. But for this moment, this one silent, smoke-kissed moment, she allowed herself peace because Oakpath had fallen. And something new might finally rise. By the third day, the ashes had settled. No more smoke curled from the ruins. The wind carried only soot now, fine as flour, dusting every surface with quiet memory. The ruins of the Tillman house stood like a tomb, a place where voices once echoed, and now only silence answered. Martha walked barefoot through what used to be the sitting room. Each step released a soft puff of gray. She didn't cough. She didn't cover her face. She moved through the destruction like someone walking through a memory. Slow, measured, intimate. In her hand, she carried a tin box. It was dented, rusted at the corners, hidden beneath a floorboard in the servants' quarters for years. Few knew it existed. Fewer still knew what it held. She reached the fireplace, or what remained of it, and knelt. The hearthstone was still warm. She opened the box. Inside, cloth scraps, bits of ribbon, 2 lockets with no photos, and a folded slip of parchment. On it, the names of every woman who had ever served in the Tillman house. First names only. Many crossed out. Martha ran her finger over each one. Sella, Dinah, Esther, Joe, gone, some sold, some beaten, some just vanished. And now Oakpath itself had joined that list. Sarah approached behind her, careful not to speak. She simply watched. "What will you do with it?" she asked, eyes on the box. Martha didn't answer right away. She picked up one of the cloth scraps, a red strip that Dot had once lined a bonnet, and tied it around her wrist. "You carry it," she said softly, "so no one forgets." Sarah nodded. She held out her hand, and Martha placed the box into her palm. Together, they stood. Kuro. Around them, the remains of a world that had claimed dominion over their names. Their labor, their silence, now crumbled. Powerless. But what came next? That was the question on everyone's mind. Without masters, who leads? Without orders, what comes first? Without fear, what follows? Martha didn't claim answers. She didn't want to be followed. But something about the way she moved through the ruins, steady, calm, barefoot and unshaken, made others fall in behind her without needing to be told. She returned to the clothesline, the same one where secrets once whispered in the wind. Only now it held clean white cloths, blank, unstained a symbol. She pinned the first sheet with quiet ceremony. Not for drying, for beginning. By dusk, a group of women had gathered. None spoke of the fire. None said the name Tillman. They passed tools, moved buckets, shared bread. They worked as if summoned by something invisible but undeniable. They were building, not a house, something deeper. A way. Ash covered their arms, but it no longer looked like ruin. It looked like foundation. Sarah leaned against the laundry post, watching the line sway. "You ever think we'd see this?" she asked. Martha looked at the horizon, red again, but this time from sunset. "Not smoke. No," she whispered. But I never stopped dreaming it. That night, beneath a sky full of stars and silence, Martha sat alone beside the ruins. She took a fistful of ash into her hands, closed her eyes, and smiled. Because in those ashes she didn't see the end. She saw something finally clean. It began as laundry, just one white sheet hung on the line, nothing unusual, nothing worth noticing. But in a place like Oakpath, where every stitch once meant submission, the ordinary could become radical. That sheet was no longer a symbol of servitude. It was a signal. By sunrise, 2 more appeared, longer, cleaner, stretched across the field like banners. Not waving for surrender, not surrendering anything. They fluttered in the breeze like quiet declarations. Martha stood beside the line, pinning each with care. The air smelled of ash and wildflowers, a strange mix, a new mix. Sarah approached, arms full of linens. "You think they'll understand? They'll feel it," Martha replied. "They already do." And they did. Within a day, other farms saw the sheets, and other women started hanging their own, not just to dry, but to mark themselves, to say we are still here, to say this land no longer belongs to silence. The sheet became a code, not for rebellion, not for escape, but for presence, a way to claim visibility in a world that once erased their very breath. Even those who didn't know Martha's name watched her now. She moved like a ghost had left her, as if something had finally exhaled from her chest and made room for something alive. She no longer flinched at creaking floorboards. She no longer kept one ear tuned to the master's voice. She walked through the plantation like it didn't own her anymore, because it didn't. Rumors spread, of course. Some said Martha had gone mad. Others whispered she had powers, that she'd spoken to fire, that her touch turned stone to cinder. But the truth was quieter and more dangerous. She'd survived, and she'd done it without begging, without bloodshed, without becoming cruel. That kind of survival scared people more than rage ever could. One evening, a stranger arrived at the edge of Oak Path, a woman, tall, scarred, leading a small child by the hand. Her shoes were worn to the sole. She stopped before the laundry line, eyes wide. "You Martha?" she asked. "Yo?" Martha nodded. The woman looked at the sheets, then at her child, then back. "Can we stay a while?" Martha smiled. "There's room," she said. "If you work, if you respect, there's room." The child ran toward the line, chasing a cloth caught in the breeze. He laughed. Sharp, high, sudden. The first laugh Oak Path had heard in weeks, and just like that the air shifted again. Sarah brought bread. Others followed. No one said the words freedom or justice. They were still too heavy. But in their place, rest. In their place, choice. The white sheet danced overhead, catching the sun just right, glowing like a flame without heat. "You," a boy asked Martha. "Why white?" "You?" She paused, kneeling beside him. "Because it's clean," she said. "Because it means starting over. Not forgetting, just not carrying it all no more." The boy nodded. "No," and ran off smiling. That night, a soft wind blew across Oak Path, lifting the edges of the laundry like sails. From the woods, distant eyes watched, wondering, doubting, maybe even hoping. Because even in silence, stories travel. And at Oak Path, a new story had begun, told in linen, stitched in ash, pinned to the wind. The road to Oak Path had once been feared, so it wound through the woods like a warning, where the trees leaned in too close and the shadows whispered of chains. Travelers passed quickly, even animals avoided its heart. But now that road had changed. It was still dirt, still crooked, still lined with the ghosts of old patrols. But it was no longer a path of capture. Now it was a thread of return. People came not in chains, but on foot, slowly, humbly, with bundles on their backs and hope in their eyes. Some carried nothing but their names. Others brought tools, seeds, or children. They weren't all running. Some were returning, to see what remained, to mourn what was lost, to ask if they could still belong to something, anything that didn't come with pain stitched into its seams. Martha saw them before anyone else. She always did. From the edge of the field, she watched each figure approach. She never waved, never called out, just waited. They came from all directions, nearby towns, far-off counties, places she couldn't even pronounce, some barefoot, some limping, some with faces she remembered from long ago. One morning, a boy arrived, except he wasn't a boy anymore. He'd left as a child, snuck away during a sugarcane harvest. Word had it he'd made it north, joined a school, learned to read, even changed his name. But here he was, older, taller, jawline sharp, but eyes the same. He stood by the gate, unsure. Martha didn't move to greet him. She let him come. "I didn't think anything would be left," he said quietly. "Not much is," Martha answered. "But enough." He looked around. The laundry lines, the garden, the sheet pinned to the main post. "What is this place now?" Martha took her time answering. "A patch." He frowned. "Like farmland?" "No," she said. "Like a patch on a torn cloth. Small, maybe fragile, but it holds." He looked at her, and something inside him softened. Another woman came days later, carrying her father's walking stick. He used to talk about this land, she said. Said he built the east wall with his bare hands. I wanted to see it. Martha showed her what was left of that wall, moss-covered and cracked. But when the woman touched it, she cried, because stone holds memory too. Every return stitched something new into oak path skin. A fence mended, a well cleared, a lullaby sung over a rebuilt cradle. And still Martha watched. She didn't lead, she didn't claim. She simply held the space, like hands cupped around a flickering flame. People came and went. Some stayed, some didn't. That was the point, choice. The land wasn't easy. The soil was tired. But for the first time in memory, it wasn't tired of them. No, Sarah kept a journal, a simple ledger of names and dates and where they'd walked from. It wasn't formal. No titles, no records, just reminders that they had been, that they are, that they returned. No, because healing doesn't shout, it whispers. It walks with bare feet and stitched coats and a heart full of hesitation. No, and sometimes it finds its way home. In a box beneath her bed, Martha kept scraps. Not riches, not secrets. Just folded bits of paper, some torn from ledgers, others from old hymnals. Each one bore a message she'd written but never sent. Letters to people who'd never received them. No, she began writing them during the long nights, back when silence was her only company. When voices were dangerous and memory too loud. At first they were short. They were shortens. Sarah, if we run, will you still sing? Ma'am, I haven't forgotten your hands. But over time they became fuller, each letter a kind of exhale, a way to speak in a world that never let her voice matter. After the fire, after the sheet, after the returns. She began writing again. Only this time the words didn't feel heavy. They felt like threads. One evening, by candlelight, she unfolded one and read it aloud. To the girl I was, she began. No, you were quiet because the world taught you to be. You bowed because they told you that standing was dangerous. You didn't cry when your first child was taken because you knew no one would offer comfort. She paused. The room was still, but now she continued. You walk with both feet firm. You speak with your hands, with your eyes, with your very breath. And though you are still afraid, you are no longer owned by it. She folded the letter and slid it back into the box. Sarah stood in the doorway, having heard every word. Oh, you ever think about mailing them? She asked. Martha shook her head. They weren't for mailing, she said. They were for remembering. Still, Sarah said, walking in, I think they're worth hearing. The next morning, something new appeared on the sheet line. Not laundry, not cloth. A letter, pinned at the center, fluttering gently. By noon, 2 more had joined it. By dusk, 5. No people came by just to read. No one asked who wrote them. No one removed them. They treated them like prayers. Some were addressed to mothers, some to children. Some to a God I still believe in, though I don't know why. Every line stitched another piece of the Oak Path story. Not the story of fire or ruin, but of endurance. Martha watched it unfold like a quilt across time. Yo, she added another. Yon to the woman who carried me through storms. It read, your silence taught me how to listen. Your courage showed me how to stay, pinned, lifted, read. No one asked for permission. Because the line belonged to all now, not as property, but as offering. No. Each letter fluttered in the breeze like leaves refusing to fall. No, and in their shadows children played, lovers leaned close. Old men wept quietly. The air became layered with voices never heard aloud. Sarah added one too. Quote, to the one I buried beneath the magnolia tree, it read, I kept the ribbon. I kept the song. I kept going. Oh, Martha nodded when she read it. That night, lightning flickered far off in the hills, but Vrahs wished to hide. Because they knew now. No. Some storms cleanse, others carve, and some bring letters back to life. It was late spring when he arrived. The trees had just begun to bloom again. and the winds carried the scent of honeysuckle through oak paths fields. The sheets danced softly in the air like quiet hymns. And then the rider came, Ickle, a tall man on a bay horse, dusty from the road, wearing a coat too fine for travel and boots too clean for work. His presence turned heads before he even dismounted. He said nothing at first, just looked. Children paused their games. Sarah set down her basket. Martha stood still by the line. The man removed his hat and nodded politely. My name's Mr. Harold Finch, he said, voice smooth. From Charleston. Looking for someone? Nobody answered. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was yellowed, creased from travel. At its center, a sketch, not a photograph, but a drawing. A woman in a bonnet standing by a well. This her? He asked, holding it out. The crowd didn't move. But Martha stepped forward. She didn't look at the paper. Oh, she looked at him. What do you want? She asked. Finch paused. Truth, he said. Or maybe just the rest of the story. His gaze wandered to the ruins in the distance. The remains of the Tillman house, now overgrown and quiet. My grandfather lived here, Finch continued. He spoke of it before he passed, said something happened. Something he never could explain. Martha said nothing. I'm not here to claim anything, he added. Just to understand. Oh, she studied his face. He looked young but carried an old grief, the kind passed down, not earned. He didn't wear judgment, just curiosity. The kind that sometimes comes after generations forget how to listen. You're late, she said flatly. I know. She led him to the garden. They walked past the sheet line, where the letters still fluttered, past the children's shoes left neatly on the porch, past the tree where the bell no longer rang. At a stump she stopped. This is where it ended, she said, and where it began again. Finch looked down. Charred roots still marked the wood like veins through bone. He knelt, placing a hand on the stump's surface. It feels quiet. It earned its quiet, Martha replied. He nodded. Later, he sat with Sarah. Listen to the stories. Read a few of the letters. Ask no foolish questions. He stayed one night. Just one. And before leaving, he approached Martha again. Do you want the drawing? He asked, holding it out. She took it, examined it closely this time. It was her, younger, but unmistakable. Oh? She didn't ask how his grandfather had known her face. She didn't need to. You can keep it, she said. He smiled gently. I already have, he replied, tapping his temple. They shook hands. Quote, not as owner and property, not as blood and debt, as people, as witnesses, as two ends of a story finally reaching the same page. When his horse disappeared down the path, Martha unfolded the drawing one more time. She pinned it to the sheet line, not as proof, but as a thread. Because some stories don't need closure. They just need to be seen. The sheets still wave. Long after the smoke vanished, after the footsteps faded, after the letters turned soft at the edges, the laundry line stood strong. The oak path, though changed, never forgot. Martha's hair had turned silver now. Her hands were slower, but still steady. Every morning she stepped out and pinned fresh linen to the line, not out of habit, not out of duty. But because the wash never ends, it wasn't about cleanliness anymore. It was about continuity. Children who had grown up playing beneath those sheets now brought their own children to visit. They'd point and say, that's where Miss Martha taught us to listen. Or, that's where Mama wrote her first letter. And always there was the line. It didn't sag, because every soul who ever walked through Oak Path had helped carry its weight. One day, Sarah brought out a piece of cloth unlike any before, dyed deep indigo, hand-stitched at the edges. Made this from the scraps, she told Martha. Didn't want them thrown out. Martha held it up. It shimmered in the morning sun like water. Let's hang it, Sarah said. So they did, not on the end, but right in the center. It flapped loud and bold, catching attention. Children gathered curious. What's it mean? One asked. Martha smiled. It means we still got color left, she said, even after all that's been wrung out. That day, others began adding their own, a corner of muslin with embroidery, a piece of a dress from the city, an old meal sack stitched with initials. The line became a living quilt. Each fabric a voice, each voice a witness. Soon, a woman came with a camera, said she was writing a book. She snapped photos of the line, of the old stump, of the ruin beyond the magnolia tree. She interviewed Martha, who sat on her porch with Sarah beside her, hands folded like a hymn book. "Ew, do you regret any of it?" the woman asked. Martha looked out across the fields. "I regret I had to do it," she said, "but I don't regret that it worked." She didn't say more. Didn't need to. The woman closed her notebook gently. Before she left, she asked one last question. "What should I call this place now?" Martha's answer came like breath. Unfolded. And that's what the book would be named. Years later, it would sit in libraries, in schools, in places where the name Oakpath had once been a whisper of pain. Now it carried weight and hope. Not because it had forgotten, but because it had dared to keep hanging the sheets. One summer evening, with thunder rumbling far off, Martha stood at the line, pinning the final cloth of the day. A child ran up beside her. "Why do we still wash 'em?" she asked. "Ain't nobody here to check anymore." Martha looked down at her, eyes full of gentle certainty. "We don't wash for them," she said. "We wash so we remember. We're worth clean things. Not fully enchanting, but someday the wind picked up, and the line danced again, a ribbon of defiance, a song of labor, a thread that time couldn't cut, because the wash never ends, and neither does the story.